This is Goku's son, DBZ, and welcome to something I'm going to start doing review vlogs on Sundays, calling it the Sunday Review, if you will. Today I'm doing a two-part discussion on review/discussion on one of my favorite books series of all time, The Chronicles of Narnia. It's the book series that got me into reading in the first place, and it's as well the book that first got me into fantasy adventure, if you will. In total, there are 7 books in, of course, the series. And really there was 6, and then later on, C.s.Lewis would create a prequel, which is technically the first book in the series that was written last. It is called, of course, and it's probably my second favorite of the series, if not my favorite book. And that would be, of course, The Magician's Nephew, which is, of course, a basic story about a boy who ends up meeting this girl. They become friends. There's this tunnel that he has access to that leads into different houses. And in this one house, he ends up in a dark, dim room. And basically, he discovers this little box with rings in it. Magical rings. And him and this girl eventually find themselves in this sort of, I guess you could say, fantasy or dimensional type gateway world. Where there's it's basically sort of like a small forest or something. There's really nothing else around, that's about it. I guess you could say it's sort of like a station of sorts between different worlds. And there's these little ponds or whatever, each lead to a different particular world. There's one particular ring you use to go from our world to there, and so on, and then there's the other ring you put on if you want to go back, to come back to our world, for instance. And in this story of The Magician's Nephew, you learn about they go to this one particular world, which is pretty much all desolate. Just shadow his former self great castle, where there was a great war, and they discover this statue, and a few drops of blood basically awaken this statue, and it's a woman, white. Now, if this sounds familiar, it should, because this woman, of course, you learn and would become known later in the second book, of course, in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, would become known as the White Witch, or calling herself the Queen of Narnia, and Empress of the Lone Islands. And it's very fascinating, and also later on, and she gets loose in our world as well, and causes a heck stir, and with a carriage and everything. And obviously, you learn about, as it progresses, she shows more and more evil side to her characteristics, and you realize this is not a good person. But then again, how she got to be the way she was in her world was fighting with her own blood over power. So there you go. And as well, they end up finding their way into this newly being created world called Narnia, and of course come face to face with the great lion, Aslan. And, of course, if you know anything about the Chronicles of Narnia and about the author C.s.Lewis, you know that basically his whole theme, with Aslan, is supposed to be a representation of God. Of course, he was a Christian. His journey to religion actually started before starting the Chronicles of Narnia, but as the books evolved, he evolved, I guess you could say. He started out more of like a humanist, atheist type. Then he became more towards like paganism with theology and everything, and that's why he has so many elements of like dryads, naiads, thorns, and other mythical creatures of like the Greek mythology in the world of Narnia. That's why. And of course, he ends up finding himself in Christianity. But it's a very long journey if you read and learn about the biography on C.S. Lewis. And anyways, back to, of course, Magician's Nephew. And as like this carriage ends up in the world of Narnia as it's being created, a lamppost is torn off on the street in our world and gets carried into the world of Narnia. And when you know it, the lamppost actually gets into the magical soil and ground of Narnia and ends up somehow growing like a tree, I guess you could say. And, of course, therein lies how the lamppost comes to be in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And also, one last thing before I go to Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and that is with the Magician's Nephew. The boy who is the Magician's Nephew, later on, you learn, if you pay attention to things, has a magical tree from Narnia in his yard of his house, and later on it would be torn down and turned into, what else? A wardrobe. And he ends up becoming, I guess you could say, reasonably powerful. And if I am by the way, spoiler alert, the old man, the uncle of the 4 children in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, is the boy from the Magician's Nephew. If anybody hasn't read all the Chronicles of Narnia books, that's a major spoiler there. But that it explains and fills in the gaps to why he, at the end of the second book, or first book technically when it was written, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and he says that to Peter and them, that once a king in Narnia, always a king in Narnia. And that's how he knew. Because he'd been to Narnia himself and met Aslan. And of course, the dear White Witch. And that brings us to the second book of the series, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is most definitely the most widely known of all the books, by far. And that explains, like, when you saw the live-action movie by Walt Disney, how much money it made. It pulled in over $700 million. That's why it's the most well-known of the Chronicles of Narnia books. But there are other great books like The Magician's Nephew. It's a really solid book, really great, and it fills in a lot of the gaps to Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I recommend, if you haven't read The Magician's Nephew. But in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, it's a really good story and really interesting, of course. And, of course, you learn a lot more about Aslan, obviously, as well as the dear White Witch, which has the power to turn people into stone, thanks to her magical wand. And, of course, through a quick, basic thing, the children, of course, it starts out with the youngest of the children, of course, Lucy. Finds her way first to Narnia and meets a thorn called Thomas. And she gets to talking with him and learns things about the land of Narnia and everything revolving around that particular fantasy world. And she learns, of course, about the White Witch. And that if he was ever to come across a son of Adam or a daughter of Eve, he was to capture them and play him to sleep with his flute and to hand them over so she may kill them and have their blood. And that is some of the very basics at the beginning of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe book. But also, of course, you have the great battle at the end of that, which is a solid book and good movie, and I recommend, if you haven't seen, check out the BBC original Chronicles of Narnia movies. They're really good and pretty loyal to the source material. I'm going to have to get ready to cut this up, part 1 of the Chronicles of Narnia review. So I've only done, technically, I guess, somewhat 2 books so far. And there's, of course, 5 more. And I'll take a little bit and mainly talk about the more well-known books. But this is Goku-san DBZ, and I hope you enjoyed my first part to my review of the Chronicles of Narnia. And, of course, as always, this is Goku-san DBZ. Peace out. YouTube land.